Margaret Sullivan ran her fingers along the dusty frame, her practiced eye immediately drawn to the formal portrait of 4 children. The photography studio in Hartford, Connecticut had captured them perfectly in 1907. 2 boys in sailor suits, 2 girls in pristine white dresses with elaborate bows. Their expressions were solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era, but something about their eyes seemed to hold a secret. As an antique appraiser with 30 years of experience, Margaret had seen thousands of vintage photographs. This one, discovered in a cramped estate sale in rural Vermont, should have been unremarkable. The seller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, claimed it belonged to her late husband's collection. "Found it in the attic," she'd said with a shrug. "Figured someone might want it for the frame." Margaret paid $20 without haggling. The ornate silver frame alone was worth triple that, but something about the photograph itself intrigued her. The children's clothing suggested a well-to-do family, and the professional studio setting indicated this was an important portrait, likely commissioned for a special occasion. Back in her Boston shop, Margaret placed the portrait on her restoration table under a bright LED lamp. The children stared back at her with those haunting, knowing eyes. The oldest boy, perhaps 12, stood protectively behind his younger siblings. The girls, twins by their appearance, couldn't have been more than 6. The youngest boy gripped a wooden toy horse. As Margaret began cleaning the glass with a soft cloth, she noticed something odd. Behind the children, barely visible in the photograph's background, was what appeared to be a large mirror or reflective surface. The studio photographer had positioned it to create depth, but in doing so, had inadvertently captured something that would remain hidden for over a century. Margaret adjusted her magnifying glass and leaned closer. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. In the mirror's reflection, barely visible but unmistakably there, stood a 5th figure, an adult man in a dark coat, watching the children from outside the camera's direct view. But this wasn't just any observer. This man was someone who, according to historical records, should have been impossible to capture in this photograph. She reached for her high-resolution scanner, her hands trembling slightly. After 30 years of appraising antiques, she developed an instinct for the extraordinary, and this photograph was screaming at her that something was very wrong. The digital scan revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The man in the reflection wore a distinctive military uniform, not American, but European. More troubling still, she could make out a medal on his chest, one she recognized from her extensive research into military memorabilia. Margaret's pulse quickened. She grabbed her reference books, flipping through pages of military insignia until she found what she was looking for. The Iron Cross, 2nd class, a German military decoration that wasn't established until 1813, and this particular variation wasn't issued until 1870. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The man's face, though partially obscured by shadow, bore a striking resemblance to someone Margaret had seen before in historical photographs. Someone who had no business being in Hartford, Connecticut in 1907. Someone whose presence would suggest this portrait held secrets that could rewrite everything historians thought they knew about pre-World War I America. She picked up her phone to call her colleague, Dr. James Morrison at Harvard's history department, then hesitated. Was she seeing things that weren't there? After all, old photographs often played tricks on the eye. But as she looked again at the children's solemn faces, she noticed something else. The oldest boy wasn't looking at the camera. His gaze was directed slightly to the left, toward the mirror, toward the mysterious figure in the reflection. Dr. James Morrison arrived at Margaret's shop within an hour of her call. A specialist in American immigration history, he'd helped her authenticate dozens of historical photographs over the years. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined the portrait under various lighting conditions and magnification levels. "Margaret, if this is what I think it is, we're looking at something extraordinary," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But we need to be absolutely certain before we make any claims. The implications would be staggering." They began by researching the photography studio. The embossed mark on the frame read, "Hartwell and Associates, Hartford, Connecticut." City records showed that Theodore Hartwell operated a portrait studio on Main Street from 1905 to 1912. His client ledgers, preserved in the Connecticut Historical Society, might hold the key to identifying the children. The next morning, Margaret and James drove to Hartford. The Historical Society's archives were housed in a converted Victorian mansion, its rooms filled with carefully cataloged documents and artifacts. Sarah Chen, the head archivist, greeted them warmly. When Margaret mentioned finding a photograph at an estate sale, Sarah's expression brightened. "You must have bought it from my grandmother," she said with surprise. "Mrs. Chen was my husband's grandmother. She passed away last month, and we've been slowly going through her belongings. My late husband's grandfather collected all sorts of historical items, but we never really understood their significance." Sarah led them to the archives where Hartwell's studio records were kept. The leather-bound ledger for 1907 was remarkably well preserved. James ran his finger down the entries for September and October, looking for any mention of children's portraits. Then he stopped. "Here," he said, pointing to an entry dated October 15, 1907. "Portrait session. Zimmerman children. 4 subjects. Special instructions. Discretion required. Payment in advance. $50. $50 in 1907 was an enormous sum for a portrait, nearly 2 months' wages for the average worker. Someone had paid handsomely for this photograph and for the photographer's discretion. The question was why. The name Zimmerman led them down a rabbit hole of genealogical research that consumed the next 3 days. Margaret and James discovered that Klaus Zimmerman had emigrated from Prussia to Connecticut in 1895, establishing himself as a successful textile merchant in Hartford. He'd married Anna Mueller, also a German immigrant, and they'd had 4 children: Heinrich, Greta, Liesel, and young Wilhelm. On the surface, the Zimmermans appeared to be model American immigrants. Klaus had anglicized his name to Charles, learned English fluently, and integrated into Hartford's business community. The children attended local schools and, according to newspaper social columns, were well regarded in the community. But Dr. Morrison's deeper investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies. Immigration records showed Klaus Zimmerman had listed his previous occupation as merchant, but Prussian military records told a different story. Before emigrating, Klaus Zimmerman had served as a captain in the Prussian army, specifically in military intelligence. More disturbing still, he'd maintained correspondence with German military contacts well after settling in America. The pieces began falling into place when they discovered a cache of letters in the German-American Cultural Center's archives. Written in German, the letters revealed that Klaus Zimmerman was part of a network of German immigrants who were quietly gathering intelligence on American industrial capabilities. The 1907 portrait wasn't just a family photograph. It was evidence of a meeting that should never have happened. Margaret stared at the photograph again, understanding now why the children looked so solemn, so knowing. They weren't just posing for a family portrait. They were witnesses to something far more significant. The man in the reflection wasn't a casual observer. He was Klaus Zimmerman's handler, a German intelligence officer operating on American soil 6 years before World War I would begin. The oldest boy, Heinrich, had been looking toward the mirror because he knew the man was there. At 12 years old, he was already being prepared to continue his father's secret work. The photograph captured not just 4 innocent children, but the next generation of what would become one of America's earliest spy networks. Armed with this new understanding, Margaret and Dr. Morrison began tracing the connections between Klaus Zimmerman and other German immigrants in Connecticut. What they discovered was a sophisticated intelligence network that had been operating under the noses of American authorities for over a decade. The German officer in the photograph's reflection had been identified through military records as Major Friedrich Steinbach, officially listed as a cultural attaché at the German embassy in Washington. However, decoded diplomatic cables revealed his true role as coordinator of German intelligence operations in New England's industrial centers. Hartford in 1907 was a hub of American manufacturing, home to Colt firearms, Pratt & Whitney, and numerous other companies producing machinery that would prove crucial in the coming World War. Klaus Zimmerman's textile business provided perfect cover for gathering information about production capabilities, worker populations, and industrial innovations. The children in the photograph weren't just Klaus's family, they were his future assets. Heinrich, the eldest, had been enrolled in a prestigious boarding school where he befriended the sons of prominent industrialists. Greta and Liesel attended social events where they could overhear conversations between their American classmates' parents. Even young Wilhelm, at age 4, was being taught to listen and remember. Dr. Morrison discovered that other German-American families in the network used similar tactics. Children were the perfect spies, invisible, trusted, and welcomed into spaces where adults might be viewed with suspicion. The 1907 portrait session had been arranged to allow Major Steinbach to meet with Klaus and receive his latest intelligence reports while maintaining plausible cover. But something had gone wrong. The photographer, Theodore Hartwell had inadvertently captured Steinbach's reflection in the background mirror. If this photograph had fallen into the wrong hands in 1907, it could have exposed the entire network and led to diplomatic disaster between Germany and the United States. Margaret realized that Mrs. Chen's grandfather hadn't just been a collector of antiques. He'd been part of the cover-up, tasked with acquiring and hiding evidence of the spy network's activities. Their investigation led them back to Theodore Hartwell, the photographer who had unknowingly documented this clandestine meeting. Hartwell's personal papers, donated to the Hartford Public Library by his descendants, revealed a man tormented by what he had inadvertently captured. In a diary entry dated October 16, 1907, the day after the portrait session, Hartwell wrote, "The Zimmerman Commission troubles me greatly. I was instructed to photograph only the children, but the positioning they requested seemed odd. When I developed the plates, I discovered I had captured something I was never meant to see. Mr. Zimmerman paid me extra for my discretion, but how can I remain silent about what I witnessed?" Subsequent entries showed Hartwell grappling with his conscience. He'd recognized Major Steinbach from newspaper photographs of diplomatic events, and he understood the implications of a German military officer secretly meeting with German-American citizens. The United States wasn't at war with Germany in 1907, but tensions were rising, and any foreign intelligence operations would be viewed as deeply suspicious. Hartwell's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He created 2 sets of prints from the portrait session. The first set, delivered to Klaus Zimmermann, had been carefully retouched to eliminate any trace of the reflection. The second set, the one that had ended up in Mrs. Chen's grandfather's collection, preserved the original image as evidence. Margaret and Dr. Morrison found Hartwell's detailed notes about the retouching process. Using a magnifying glass and careful brushwork, he had painted over the reflection in the background mirror, replacing it with an innocuous studio backdrop. The Zimmermans received their family portrait with no indication that their secret had been captured. But Hartwell kept the original negative and one unretouched print as insurance. His diary revealed his plan. If German-American relations deteriorated and the spy network posed a threat to American security, he would turn the evidence over to authorities. The photograph would be his contribution to protecting his country. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 must have validated Hartwell's concerns. But by then, the spy network had already adapted to wartime conditions. As World War I erupted in Europe, the German-American intelligence network faced unprecedented scrutiny. Margaret and Dr. Morrison's research revealed that Klaus Zimmermann and his associates had continued their operations even as anti-German sentiment swept across America. The portrait, hidden for over a century, began to make sense as evidence of how deeply German intelligence had penetrated American society. By 1917, when America entered the war, the Zimmermann family had dispersed. Klaus had quietly closed his textile business and moved to Chicago, ostensibly for new opportunities, but actually to avoid the increasing surveillance of German Americans in Connecticut. Heinrich, now 22, had enlisted in the U.S. Army, a perfect cover for a German agent, allowing him access to American military intelligence while demonstrating his supposed patriotism. The twins, Greta and Liesel, had married into prominent American families, their childhood training in observation and information gathering serving them well as they hosted dinner parties and social gatherings where military and industrial leaders spoke freely about war production and strategy. Young Wilhelm had been sent to relatives in neutral Switzerland, officially for his education, but actually to maintain communications with German intelligence. Dr. Morrison uncovered classified FBI files from the 1918 investigation into German espionage activities. The Bureau had suspected the existence of the Connecticut network but had never found concrete evidence. Dozens of German Americans had been investigated, some imprisoned, others deported, but the core of the operation had remained hidden. The photograph Margaret had discovered wasn't just evidence of a single meeting. It was proof of the most successful German intelligence operation on American soil during the early 20th century. Major Steinbach's presence in the reflection confirmed that the network had been directly controlled by German military intelligence, not just composed of sympathetic immigrants acting independently. But the story had another twist. As Margaret examined the children's faces again, she noticed something she'd missed before. The youngest child, Wilhelm, was holding that wooden toy horse in a very specific way. His small fingers were positioned to display a tiny marking carved into the wood. a marking that matched symbols found in other German intelligence communications from the period. Even at age 4, Wilhelm Zimmermann had been part of the operation. Margaret's discovery took an unexpected turn when Sarah Chen, the archivist, revealed additional information about her family's connection to the photograph. Sarah's husband had been William Zimmermann, Wilhelm's grandson. The photograph hadn't ended up in a random collection. It had been deliberately preserved by the very family it documented. "My husband never talked much about his grandfather," Sarah explained during their third meeting at the Historical Society. "He just said the old man had come from Germany and died when William was young. But after his death last year, I found boxes of documents and photographs in the basement. Most were in German, which I couldn't read. Those boxes contained the missing pieces of the story." William Zimmermann, the 4-year-old boy in the photograph, had indeed been sent to Switzerland in 1917. But rather than continuing his family's espionage activities, he had been profoundly affected by witnessing the war's devastation. He returned to America in 1925 as a changed man, determined to make amends for his family's betrayal. Working secretly with FBI counterintelligence agents, William had spent decades helping to identify and neutralize other German intelligence networks that had survived the war. His apparent collection of historical artifacts was actually a carefully maintained archive of evidence, preserved for the day when the full story could be told without compromising ongoing investigations. The photograph had been his insurance policy. If anyone ever questioned his family's loyalty to America, or if historians tried to minimize the extent of German espionage activities, the portrait would serve as undeniable proof of what had really happened in places like Hartford, Connecticut. Margaret realized that Mrs. Chen's decision to sell her late husband's collection wasn't random. At 93, she had been following William's final instructions to ensure the evidence eventually reached someone who would understand its significance. The $20 price tag had been deliberately low, designed to attract serious collectors who would investigate the photograph's origins. Sarah Chen smiled sadly as she showed them William's final letter, written shortly before his death. "The children in this photograph were trained to betray their country before they were old enough to understand what patriotism meant. I spent my life trying to undo that damage. Now it's time for the truth to come out." The full scope of the German intelligence network became clear as Margaret and Dr. Morrison compiled their research. The 1907 photograph wasn't just evidence of espionage. It documented a generational conspiracy that had shaped American industrial development in ways historians had never imagined. Klaus Zimmermann's reports to Major Steinbach had provided German military planners with detailed information about American manufacturing capabilities years before World War I began. This intelligence had influenced German strategic decisions, including their unrealistic confidence that America's industrial capacity couldn't support a significant military intervention in Europe. The irony was devastating. The spy network's success had actually hurt Germany's war effort. By overestimating their understanding of American capabilities and underestimating the speed of wartime industrial expansion, German leaders had made crucial miscalculations that contributed to their eventual defeat. Heinrich Zimmermann's service in the U.S. Army had ended tragically. FBI files revealed that he'd been exposed as a German agent in 1918, court-martialed, and executed for treason. His military service record had been classified for decades to avoid embarrassing the Army's intelligence failures. The twins' marriages had been calculated moves designed to maintain their access to American industrial and military circles. But Greta had genuinely fallen in love with her American husband and eventually became a double agent, feeding false information back to her German contacts while providing real intelligence to American authorities. Liesel had maintained her loyalty to Germany throughout the war, but died in the 1918 influenza pandemic before she could be arrested. Only Wilhelm had survived to see the network's complete destruction. His transformation from child spy to American patriot represented a redemption that had taken decades to achieve. The photograph's preservation had been his way of ensuring that future generations would understand both the threat that had once existed and the price paid to eliminate it. Dr. Morrison's analysis revealed that at least 30 German-American families in New England had been part of the broader network. Children had been systematically trained as intelligence assets, their innocence weaponized against their adopted country. The 1907 portrait captured not just one family's secrets, but evidence of the most extensive foreign intelligence operation in American history prior to World War II. The authentication process took 6 months, involving forensic photography experts, handwriting analysts, and military historians from 3 universities. Every detail of Margaret's discovery was scrutinized and verified. The photograph was indeed genuine, and its implications were staggering. The Smithsonian Institution acquired the portrait for its National Security Exhibition, where it now stands as a stark reminder of how foreign intelligence operations have targeted American society throughout history. The children's innocent faces serve as a powerful symbol of how espionage can corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships. Margaret's discovery led to a broader re-examination of German-American immigration patterns in the early 20th century. Historians found evidence of similar networks operating in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Milwaukee, industrial centers where German immigrants had established businesses that provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering. The FBI declassified hundreds of related documents, revealing the extent to which foreign intelligence services had penetrated American society decades before anyone realized the threat existed. The photograph became a cornerstone exhibit in the agency's museum, illustrating how a single piece of evidence could unlock secrets hidden for over a century. Sarah Chen donated her late husband's entire archive to the National Archives, ensuring that William Zimmerman's decades of counterintelligence work would be preserved for future researchers. His transformation from unwilling child spy to American patriot became the subject of a best-selling biography that helped Americans understand how immigrants could overcome the sins of their parents' generation. The photograph's journey from a Vermont estate sale to a museum showcase demonstrated how history's most important secrets often hide in plain sight, waiting for the right person to notice what everyone else had missed. Margaret Sullivan's trained eye and persistence had uncovered a story that changed how Americans understood their own past. Today, visitors to the Smithsonian pause before the 1907 portrait, studying the children's solemn faces and searching for the reflection that revealed so much. The wooden toy horse in Wilhelm's hands serves as a reminder that even the smallest details in history can carry the weight of nations, and that sometimes the most innocent-looking photographs hold the darkest secrets. The portrait's legacy continues to influence how intelligence agencies analyze historical evidence and how historians approach seemingly ordinary artifacts. In an age of digital photography and sophisticated surveillance, the simple accident that captured Major Steinbach's reflection serves as a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's hidden.